Musa, and for those of you who do not know me, I'm professor and chair in the Department of Life Science Communication, organizing the LSC Colloquium this semester. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Hart, who has a joint appointment in the Department of Communication and Media and the program in the environment at the University of Michigan. He specializes in strategic communication related to environment, science, and risk issues with an emphasis of climate change. So a lot of overlap with the work we're doing here in LSE, particularly myself, and others in this room. So we're really delighted to have him. His research includes understanding the role of the media in motivating and engaging the public, and how to create effective messages that can cross ideological divides. So please join me in welcoming Saul.
Thank you so much, Dominique. As a sound check, is that good for the mic volume? Yeah? Okay. So welcome, everyone. Like Dominique said, I'm a professor at University of Michigan. And so I'll give you a short intro to myself and then talk today about some studies that I did with others, including Sedona, who is here, on climate change advocacy and engagement. Really excited to talk to you all about this. So first, just an overview of what I do. So my work is in content analysis for understanding media narratives. So in a lot of my research, I've looked at threat and efficacy and how media conveys that to the public. I've looked at how issues like climate change have become more politicized and polarized in news coverage of those issues over time. I've looked at emotion and the conveyance of different sentiment. That's a lot of what I'll be focusing on today, primarily focusing on in email and over social media. I've been doing some recent work on misinformation. I've been working with a team at Northwestern doing a BERT large language model, trying to identify misinformation like right-wing blog posts. And then also I do framing, coming from an emphasis framing perspective and trying to understand just overall climate narratives. I also do a lot of work on media effects and public opinion. In grad school, I was involved with a lot of researchers doing judgment and decision-making and biases. So these are people like Paul Slovic and other people in environmental psychology. And so that's another big thrust of what I'm interested in. And there it's looking at like boomerang and backfire effects, how well-intended messages can cause the opposite effect of what we want to have happen. Looking at how messages conveying efficacy, action, and impacts in different ways can influence public opinion. Looking at emotion, both emotional responses and emotion within content, biases in decision-making, and then ideology. And most of my work, I would say, is looking at political ideology, but ideology can be conveyed in different ways. So today, the last study I'll talk about is looking at symbolic racism, right? If we think of that as a variance in perspective in how people perceive messages about climate change. So before I go into the research, I think most of you know this, but just to kind of set the stakes, so climate change impacts are being felt now. We could talk about a lot of these, but I'm just going to show one. This is from 2019. This is an Atlantic article saying California's wildfires are 500% larger due to climate change. I mentioned this. I know people who have worked in the Forest Service in California who have been smoke jumpers and working to fight fires there, and it's really become intense in recent years where there isn't a set fire season. But this quote from this article in 2019 really captured me. So this is from a Columbia University climate scientist, Park Williams. And the article says, Park Williams recently asked some of his students to simulate the survival of the state's forests forward to the end of the century under a worst-case carbon pollution scenario. They couldn't do it. It's basically impossible, he said. The state gets so hot that in the 2070s, you have individual years where a quarter to a half of all forest areas in California is burning, but that couldn't happen because by then there would be no more forest left to burn. Now, that's not a set conclusion. That's under the worst-case scenario, but that also is 2070. It's not like in 200-300 years. It's within 50 years. That is a potential projection. From a personal perspective, with the recent Southern California wildfires we've had, I had two family members. One lost their home completely. One, their home actually didn't burn, but it's so damaged it's going to take 6 months and like smoke remediation and things like that. So this is affecting a lot of people. The other thing is we all know CO2 is increasing. From a lot of people I talk to, they don't realize it's increasing at an increasing rate. So we have exponential growth, not linear growth. But on this graph, what you can see, just to show it visually, is if you look from 1960 to 1990, which is like a 30-year time horizon, you see the parts per million goes from 320 to 360, so you see a 40 part per million growth. If you look the next 30 years, which is 1990 to 2020, you go from 360 up to 420, so a 60 part per million growth. The models are that eventually this should flatten out and hopefully decline, but I just know right now it's not just that CO2 concentrations are increasing, they're increasing at an ever faster rate. So those are the stakes of where I think it's important that the public take action to address this issue. At the same time, climate change is one of the hardest issues to communicate with the public about. We could talk a lot about the challenges that are there, but two of the main ones. So one is that climate change and the environment are two of the most polarizing issues in the US, so when we're focusing on US audiences. This is from March 24, it's a Pew survey. It was asking, what priorities do you think Congress should focus on in the year ahead? And what I'll note about this, so this red is Republican percentage agreeing with that, blue is Democrats, but this line is the difference between Republicans and Democrats. So I put in some comparison issues, but you see for protecting the environment, there's a 40-point difference between Democrats and Republicans. For dealing with climate change, it's a 47-point difference. And in comparison with other, I would say, like polarizing hot-button issues, like issues around race, it's a 33-point difference. Immigration, it's 37 points. Reducing the budget deficit, it's 28 points. So all of these are, I'd say, are polarizing issues, but it's really the environment and climate change. We have the biggest spread between Democrats and Republicans. So that's just another challenge of how receptive people are. And across the research, this is including a lot of my own research, effect sizes tend to be very small. So this is from a 2021 paper by Rode, who's a Harvard University professor. He and his team did an analysis of a bunch of different types of messages. This is the confidence interval. This line here is 0, meaning there's a null effect. This is the average effect size, which is 0.08. So I think there's two important points about this. One, this is a confidence interval range. You'll notice all of the confidence intervals, they cross 0, right? So that's maybe disappointed. The other is, if you do statistics, Hedges G, you can interpret similar to Cohen's D if you're more familiar with that. But just to kind of give the lay of the land, 0.2 is considered a small effect size, 0.1 is considered very small. This average across different effects is 0.08. So you just have an incredibly small effect size. And this is for changing attitudes. In this study, they mentioned it kind of as a footnote, but if you look at changes in policy support, Hedges G for that was 0.01, which is basically nothing. So that's just I would say those are kind of the stakes. We have this really serious issue. We have a polarized environment. A lot of well-intentioned researchers, including myself, are trying to find ways to communicate effectively with the public around this. And for the most part, we're seeing really small effect sizes on this issue. So the question that I still ask is, so how can we successfully engage the public around climate change? And so the studies I'll talk with you about today, I have 3 studies that are examining emotion and engagement online. The first is about email campaigns, and then I have 2 looking at Facebook. And that will be about 25 minutes. And then 10 minutes, I have a study that's not directly related in terms of emotion, but it is looking at engagement. And this is about racial attitudes and talking about unequal impacts of climate change. Basically, if you talk about how class versus race can drive unequal impacts of climate change, how do people respond to that, including whether the message recipients are white or black, so how race can affect that, and then also whether they have high or low levels of symbolic racism. So that's what we'll be talking about today. First, to jump into sentiment and engagement, to give a brief background on this. So emotion plays a critical role in driving action, and there's been decades of literature on this. I won't belabor it, but Paul Slovic has demonstrated this, but also recent research by myself, by Skirka, by others in this room, right, is that if you want people to engage in action, it's really important to pay attention to how they're emotionally responding to things, that people aren't just analytic thinkers, that emotion drives a lot of how we see the world, how we behave in the world. There is a debate over emotion and engagement. And specifically between positive and negative emotion and how that can drive engagement. So there's a substantial literature, including the vast majority of political science literature, saying that we have a negativity bias. That also comes out of judgment decision-making, like prospect theory and other theories along those lines. Basically, people tend to pay more attention, be more reactive to losses, to negative sentiment, to things along those lines. So since like mid-1970s, right, there's been really strong established literature showing that. But when we think of the environment, in broader engagement, there has been some debate on this. And so some work has found that positive engagement can drive engagement. There's a bunch of citations there, but I will just point out Stuart Sorogo, who's a collaborator of mine. He definitely strongly believes in negativity bias, but in some of his own research, there has been a positivity bias where this study was about sharing news articles on Twitter, and there was a positive bias there. So it's not a universal that it's always negative sentiment that works on it. And then in the environmental domain, some scholars have raised concerns about maladaptive responses, which means people respond in a way where they avoid the issue. So the concern is that if you have messages that are very negative, that are strongly threat-based, that have a lot of negative emotion, people might feel overwhelmed, might become apathetic, and they may disengage from the issue. So I've included 2 sites here, Moser and Dilling, and O'Neill and Nicholson-Cole. This is the Fear Won't Do It, O'Neill and Nicholson-Cole article, if you're familiar with that. And so there has been a strain of research, I think, cautioning about overemphasizing threats, overemphasizing negative emotion. And so it's kind of in that debate that I had the opportunity working with others to look at actual behavioral responses to sentiment in online messages. And so I'll share with you the results of those studies. The first study is a project I did with Stuart Soroka, who's at UCLA, and Dan Heischetter-Rice, who's at Michigan State University. We were working with the Environmental Defense Fund, and the Environmental Defense Fund gave us access to their full range of emails over an extended period of time. So looking from 2011 to 2020, they launched 2,724 email campaigns. What that means is that they sent 2,724 unique emails over that time period. Are we okay?
Their microphone might be a little... Oh, that's not us, that's the other classroom. Sorry, friends.
Okay. Yeah, I hear it. Okay. Would it help if I turn off the mic, or it's not coming from us?
I think it's not us.
No, I don't think it's...
Okay.
Does it bother people like the sound, or is it fine?
We're okay? Okay. Over this period, over 300 million emails were sent, and so that's what we're analyzing. Our independent variable is positive and negative sentiment in the emails, and I'll talk about how we do that. It's a dictionary content analysis. We looked at 2 dependent variables, which the Environmental Defense Fund tracked. If we send this to people, do they open the email? And then within the email, there's often a link asking people to do something like donate to the EDF, or sign a petition, or read this website for more information. They also were able to track, after they received that email, did they open it? I don't have donation data, right? So I don't know, does this actually get people to contribute more? This was unfortunate, and I'll just say, like, as an aside, so the Environmental Defense Fund gave us access to their donation statistics, but the way that they have it in their information database, it's not directly linked to the email campaign, so I couldn't say specifically, this campaign is driving this donation, so I'm not talking about that today. The other thing is, and this is true for all of the environmental like the Facebook studies in this study, I don't have persuasive effects in terms of how it's changing attitudes, right? I don't know internally what someone's thinking. So for this, I only know, are they opening an email, and are they clicking on an email? I don't know what they do with that information. So just, I guess, putting that limitation or caution on it. How we analyze this, and so this is, it's called a Lexicoder Sentiment Dictionary. It has 6,000 words. It was developed by Young and Soroka. But positive categories are words associated with like benevolence, cheerfulness. Negative would be painfulness and disappointment. It knows if a word is preceded by a negation. So if it said like not win, it would know that that's negative. It would know rather than being positive, right? So it would count that as a negative phrase. And we use the simple measure of net sentiment. So basically, in the post, it counts the positive words, it subtracts the negative words, and then we divide that by the total words, and that's where we get the overall sentiment of a post. I will say we also looked at positive words by themselves, we looked at negative words by themselves. We used a structural topic model to control for topics across email campaigns. Just talk about that for a second. So with the EDF, they were like, monarch butterflies. People love monarch butterflies. And there were other campaigns like that where you would say, well, there might be specific sentiment associated with that, but it's really the topic that's driving effects. So we also controlled for that with a supplemental analysis just to really make sure it was sentiment that was doing the work. And then for the regression, I'm going to show you the OLS regressions. We did do Poisson also, looking at sentiment and engagement measures. So what do we find? This is, on the left, this is negative sentiment -4. On the right, you see that's positive 10. This is the first of the 99th percentile, so it's basically the full range of sentiment in these posts. And you see a fairly dramatic drop. So going from the first to the 99th, for opens, it drops 50%. For clicking within the email, it drops 80%. The overall story there is that if you're doing an email campaign, at least for the Environmental Defense Fund, it seems that negative sentiment in messages drives more engagement with those. I will note, the overall sentiment of these posts was moderately positive, right? It's in this like 3 to 4 range is where they are on average, but the more negative emails were getting more engagement from the recipients. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. And just where we were like really sure about the results, we looked at sentiment separately. So again, if you only look at the negative words, it increases engagement. If you only look at the positive words, it decreases engagement. If you interact them together, negative sentiment that has more negative but has positive mixed in, that attenuates that relationship between negative sentiment and engagement. So that's also showing that those dynamics play out in an interactive fashion. If we control for STM topics, these slopes are shallower. They aren't as steep as the other ones, but they're still going in the same direction. So even controlling for topics, we see that pattern. So here I feel at least within this range of email campaigns, fairly confident about that result. Some important notes. So one, this audience is not the general population, right? And it's important that we not generalize to the US as a whole. These are people who signed up to be on the Environmental Defense Fund email list. This also isn't cold emails they're sending out. So one, people who are more political tend to have a stronger negativity bias. So the recipients of these emails might be more prone to that. Also, these are people who are more interested in environmental issues, so they're a little bit of a unique audience. And the other thing I'll say about this study is that I don't think these results mean you should only focus on impacts and threats. I still think there's a really important role for positive efficacy to play. But I think this is a strong inkling that this kind of cautionary message of like, don't invoke fear, don't talk about threats to the environment, I would actually argue against that. Actually highlighting the threats that we face from environmental issues is an okay thing to do, and it's something that's likely to drive increased engagement on these issues. Does that make sense? Okay, so the overall finding is from that first study is that negative sentiment increases engagement, positive sentiment decreases engagement, and then I'll show two more studies where we look at that a little bit more. So what about engagement in social media? So this is a project I did with Lauren Feldman, who's at Rutgers University, Subin Choi, who's at Iowa Women's University, Sedona Chin, who's here, and then Dan Heischetter-Rice. And we were looking at Facebook posts, and specifically Facebook posts focused on climate change for a variety of issues. So to give a little bit broader background, advocacy organizations are trying to increase engagement through social media. There's been a number of studies stating that. And there's been a lot of research looking at climate narratives in the news. And so, yeah, so here we have, I would say, decades of research looking at that. But there really hasn't been that much research looking at climate narratives by advocacy organizations on social media. There's been a few that looked at specific campaigns, but that look at kind of the broad narrative as a whole. There's barely been any research that's done that. To the best of my knowledge, the first person to do that was this Vu et al. Team in 2021 that looked on Facebook. They were looking specifically at climate change organizations and the climate change narratives they were using. Now, one important thing about this Vu et al. Study is they didn't look at engagement. They were just looking at the content that was being posted. And to the best of my knowledge, no previous work before the study I'm about to show you systematically examined how climate change advocacy narratives on social media platforms like Facebook are associated with engagement. And so we were really interested in doing that. The engagement that we're measuring, so we have reactions. So this is like, do you like it? You also have sharing and commenting. So those are the three DVs we're looking at in terms of engagement on Facebook. And these offer important signals for public interest. I'll say briefly, reactions are considered kind of low effort, right? You're just like liking something. Sharing is also really easy to do. You just share it, but it's more closely tying that message with your own identity, so that can be seen as a little bit more effortful. And then if you comment on something, you actually have to write something that also would be considered a little more effortful. I'm not going to talk about everything in the content analysis. I am happy to talk about that in Q&A if you're curious about it, but I want to focus on two aspects of the content that are associated with affect. So one is impacts of climate change, which I would say is associated with negative affect, and then we also measured progress and positive sentiment. I mean, positive sentiment is positive emotions, right? So that's a direct measurement, but also making progress I would associate with that as well. We looked at 21 organizations that had a large number of followers and that also post frequently about climate change. So all of these organizations have at least 180,000 followers. Most are large national, some are large international organizations. They all post about climate change at least 100 times. The time period is 2014 to 2020. We only examined posts that mentioned climate change, so we weren't looking at the full spread of posts. I'm not going to belabor this, but this is all the organizations, their followers, and their number of climate change posts. If you want to come back and look at that, I'm happy to go back to this slide. We did a stratified sample. So what we did is we pulled 48 posts from each of these organizations, and so we had 1,008 total. this is all the coding information. I won't belabor it, except that we had 4 coders. We had good reliability after doing some training. Engagement was measured with CrowdTangle. Unfortunately, CrowdTangle is no longer available, but there was a time period where Facebook was making that available to researchers and provided that engagement information. I should note, it gives us the count of these actions people take. It does not provide the actual comment. So I don't know what people said if they commented on something. I just know the number of people who commented on each post. And these are the mean, standard deviations, and medians for engagement across the board. Is that clear? Yeah, okay. I'm like cruising over slides. I'm just pointing out that I have this. If you were like, what else did you look at and what's the frequency of different types of posts? I have this here. I'm not gonna talk about it, but if you're like, no, I really wanna see that, we can totally go back to these slides later. But just talking about impacts first, so Vu et al., they only looked at is an impact mentioned or not. We wanted to differentiate that a little bit so we know what types of impacts are being talked about. About a quarter of the post talked about environmental impacts. That was the most prominent type of impact, which I think makes sense. These are all environmental organizations. That's probably not surprising. 14% of the posts were talking about society at large. For all of the others, like public health, economy, food and agriculture, they're less than 10% of posts. So there wasn't a ton of frequency there. For progress and positive sentiment, each of these were about 10% of the posts also. But I think the theoretically interesting question is, how do those types of posts link with engagement? This is our full regression table. If you want to go back to it, I can, but I'm just going to show you specifying impacts and the progress and positive. So for impacts, the only positive associations we see is with environmental impacts and reactions. We don't see any other significant linkages there. And then for progress and positive, both of these were also had a positive association with reactions, but not with shares or comments. And so it actually, I know this is a huge table, but I do want to note, no type of content like uniformly increased or had a positive or negative association with engagement. If you look at reaction, shares, and comments together, typically it's only one type that was happening. And for future research, I'm interested in kind of exploring why that is and why we don't have more universal effects there. But the overall findings here is that, so affectively charged information can increase engagement, so we still see that. Nothing increased all types of engagement, but there is evidence that positive sentiment can increase low effort engagement, like reactions. And so I think the question here is like, does that contrast with the first study I just showed you, which is saying that positive sentiment is negatively associated with the sentiment. And so I'll try and rectify that in the third study that I'm about to show you is using the sentiment dictionary from the first study and looking at a broader set of Facebook data. So this is a project, again, with Stuart Soroka and Sedona Dan, and then also with Brian Weeks, who's also at University of Michigan, which is like, comment, or share the differential influence of valence and emotionality on engagement with environmental messaging. So our method here is we pulled a much broader number of environmental organizations. We have 99 environmental organizations. We examined all posts, so this isn't restricted to climate change posts, although that still makes up part of the corpus that we're examining. The years here, it's a broader year from 2009 to 2023. The reason it stops at 2023 is because that's when CrowdTangle stopped allowing us to pull engagement data. But we have over 500,000 posts. We have a really large number of posts we're analyzing. So we use that same sentiment dictionary that I talked about before. We also added a discrete emotions dictionary that Stuart developed with one of his graduate students, Fiorini. And then here we also analyzed the data in sentiment quintiles. When we looked at the shape of the data, it looked like for reactions, it wasn't a straight linear line, and so I'll show you what that looks like. But to give an overview of the findings, we found that, so reactions were just associated with strong emotions. So either strong positive or strong negative sentiment increased reactions, but for shares and comments, that was only associated with negative sentiment. This is a regression. I'm going to show you figures in a second. I'm not going to belabor this slide, and everything's significant because we have 500,000 posts. I can come back to this if you want the raw numbers, but I think the figures are easier to look at. So again, this is similar to what I showed you before. So this first quintile, which is the most negative 20%, is negative, but the second quintile includes neutral, right? So again, we have a bias towards more positive sentiment. What we see is in terms of reactions, so it's this first, like, more negative quintile, and then the fifth most positive quintile is the most positive, leads to higher levels of engagement. So we kind of have this, like, U roughly there. Does that make sense? But when we look at shares and comments, it's much more similar to what we saw in the first study, where it's the more negative comments that lead to more shares, more positive comments lead to less. Same with comments. More negative comments lead to more negative sentiment leads to more comments on those posts, and more positive sentiment leads to less comments on those posts. We did look at discrete emotions. I will just say briefly, it seems that sadness is a primary driver when looking at negative discrete emotions. That's a little bit surprising, but again, I don't know how people are feeling. These are posts that have words associated with sadness in them. That doesn't mean that someone reading that post feels sad. They might read that and feel angry. Because there is kind of, a lot of literature would say probably anger is more of an approach emotion, whereas like fear and sadness are more avoidant. I don't know if people felt sad when they read sad posts, but that is in the data. At least we see that association. I know one other study found that posts that had more sad reactions also had more shares associated with it. But our overall take, so if we put all these three studies together, the overall takeaway I would offer is that for low effort engagement like reactions, basically strongly charged emotional content will increase the number of reactions, right? So both negative and positive sentiment can increase that. But for high effort engagement, and so here I guess if you would accept an argument that asking someone to read an email, asking someone to click on a link on an email where they either are then going to need to donate money or they're going to need to read more about an issue or sign a petition or high effort, or higher effort, I guess, and we put that with comments and shares, we actually have a fairly consistent story for those types of engagement where negative sentiment has a positive association and positive sentiment has a more negative association. I should say those first two studies are published. This third study, just this month and last month, we've gotten the results. So we're writing it up now for publication, but hopefully that will come out soon. Okay, so that's everything I want to say about emotion engagement, and we are good on time. I'm just checking myself. So I have one more study I want to talk about that I mentioned in the beginning, which is looking at unequal impacts of climate change, and again, how emphasizing class or race in news stories influence public perceptions and support for climate policies. So this is a project I'm working on with Lauren Feldman, and then Subin Choi and Annie Zhang. And I'm realizing I need to change the association for Subin Choi.
Subin was here too, you know?
Yeah.
With me. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So yeah, also, yeah, Subin was here. So climate change has unequal impacts. I think probably most of us intuitively know this, but this isn't a widely shared sentiment in the public. So Schulten Pearson did a 23 survey, and they found that give or take 40% of the US public agrees with that. If you focus on race, within the same survey, they found that it's only 22% of the US public believe some racial groups are more vulnerable than others are. And so that's just for like baseline public opinion. That's how people see the issue currently. There is a lot of work saying that journalists do want to talk about unequal impacts of climate change. They think this is a really important story. And so I guess my work is how do we discuss this and how is the public likely to respond to that? Because there is some literature, including some of my own work from 2012, but also Tsai and Pearson and others say that discussing unequal impacts of climate change can have unintended effects. So it could increase stigmatization of the vulnerable groups who are impacted. It can also lower support for policies to address inequality by talking about that inequality. Then it can have like a backfire or boomerang effect around that. So it's really important not just saying we got to communicate about it, but how are we going to communicate about that and how will that resonate with different members of the public? The other thing that I will say is why I'm saying findings from health disparities literature is I was actually reading some work by Pearson, who's talked a lot about unequal impacts of climate change. But most of the literature being cited was actually coming from the health disparities literature, because there's been barely any literature looking at climate change specifically. So this is a review article by Lou and Niederduppy from 24. They looked at 17 studies, talking about unequal impacts of health disparities influences public opinion about those health disparities. And I mention it here because that's the main literature that people talking about climate change are leaning on. But this literature suggests that focusing on class-based inequities tends to lead to broader support for intervention, meaning that focusing basically how the poor have more health issues, have trouble finding healthcare and things like that, whereas focusing on race tends to decrease support and increase polarization. Now, of the 17 studies that Lou Niederduppy looked at, only one looked at how racial sentiment might affect this. They did a simple temperature scale, but they basically found that this is amplified where if people had a more negative view of Black communities, that this effect was heightened even more. We're talking about inequalities for Black communities, made them even more opposed to it, more skeptical of it, and things along those lines. I think climate change is a little bit different. It's a wicked problem. You don't have immediate efficacy. And so it's worth looking at inequity research, but within the context of climate change as well. There's two moderators I want to look at. And for moderator or interaction, what this just means is for symbolic racism, people who have higher levels of racism, how do they respond to messages? Or people who have lower levels of racism, how do they respond to messages? If you're not familiar with symbolic racism, it's different than explicit racism. It's a conceptual measure that's asked for individuals who may be less likely to agree with measures of explicit racism. There's decades of research on this. Interestingly, not a lot of research, though, looking at differences between, say, class and race messages across different kind of things. I only found a handful of studies doing that. But if you haven't seen these types of scales, oftentimes it's used a shortened 4-item scale. This is one of the questions I would say is, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. So people who agree with that statement, we would say have a higher level of symbolic racism. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. The other thing is social identity, and we know that group identification impacts beliefs and support for impacted groups. To say it simply, I'm interested for message recipients who are white or black, how do they respond differentially to a class-based or race-based message? And this can go either way, right? So it's partly also for black recipients, talking about black communities that are impacted, is that a mobilizing message? Or for white recipients, does that lead to more an out-group perspective where it may inhibit action on that issue? Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So the overall question is, how will participants respond to climate narratives focused on race-based versus class-based unequal impacts as moderated by symbolic racism and race of the message recipient? So the method, just to go over with a few slides, then we'll hop into the results. So we did a 5-condition design. So we talked about unequal impacts for black communities, poor communities, and working class communities. We didn't specify it, we just talked about an increased flooding risk where there was a no message control. The focus here was on an increased risk of flooding. For the participants, it's from Forthright. This isn't a representative sample, but it is a nationally diverse sample. It roughly matches census characteristics. We oversampled for black participants. We had enough power to compare white and black responses. And participants read a news story, and then they answered the DVs. I'm not going to give you time to read this, but this is what the story looked like. This would be the black community condition, just saying, news study, more dangerous floods are on the way with greater risk to black communities, and then that's specified within the text. The DVs, so we looked at 6. We had 3 overarching, which is belief in unequal impacts, aid for communities that are impacted, and support for policies to address the issue. In some of my other research, people might differentially respond about specific impacts like flooding versus climate change in general. So why there's 6 is because for each of those 3, we asked about flooding specifically and then also climate change specifically. And so I'll walk through what those look like. So for the main effect, so this is without any of the interactions, we found a significant main effect for 4 of those 6 variables, not on the policy, right? We found that just belief that unequal impacts are occurring. Participants who saw the black condition were less likely to believe that than any other condition we had. For unequal climate impacts, there wasn't a difference between black and the control, but there was between black and poor. So people exposed to the poor condition had a stronger belief than people in the black condition. That pattern was also looking at support for communities impacted by flooding and aid for those communities. And then for climate aid, this was interesting. There wasn't a difference between any condition and the black community's condition, but the poor condition was higher than the control condition. If you're interested in the ANOVA and specific means, I have those here. I can go back to them, but I'm going to skip over them right now. So moderation by symbolic racism. Again, this is how are people with high or low levels of symbolic racism responding to these messages. We have significant moderation of 5 of the 6 DVs. The general pattern, and this is a little bit more complicated, but this is the general pattern that we see, is that for individuals who have high levels of symbolic racism, when they're exposed to the black community's condition, support for, or belief in unequal impacts and support for action is lower. For people who have low levels of symbolic racism, that same exposure actually leads to more support and a greater belief. But I will say the I guess, backfire effect from the people with high levels of symbolic racism, it happens more frequently. Okay, I have a big ugly table here. This is the Johnson-Neiman results. Again, if you want to go back and see each individual interaction, I can go back with that. But this is the general pattern, and if you trust me on that, then we're good there. Okay, and then for moderation by race, again, this is on 4 of the 6 dependent variables. Here, the general pattern is basically the same across all of these. So it's really interesting. For Black participants, there's no difference between conditions. So if you do just the simple mean effects for Black participants across those, there's not a significant difference on any of our dependent variables. So we're really seeing a difference for white participants between conditions. And there, it's generally that white participants who are exposed to the Black community condition have less belief, have lower support, and things along those lines. There isn't a 3-way interaction between condition, racism, and race. And so what that means is that people who have symbolic racism are having a similar reaction regardless of if they're white or Black. I'll say higher levels of symbolic racism is definitely associated with white participants, but not exclusively so. But also for race, that difference we're seeing by whites, that's not just driven by whites who have high levels of symbolic racism. If that was the case, we'd see a significant interaction. So that, again, we're generally saying is across the board there. But the overall finding here is that beliefs about unequal impacts and support for aid is sensitive to whether race or class is emphasized. So I think this is something that in the climate context has not really been asked by many researchers. Like, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first study to do this, but that's the best of my knowledge. This can be moderated by race and symbolic racism. And focusing on class seems to be less vulnerable to backfire effects. One important caveat, though, is I'm not giving a prescription about how to talk about unequal climate impacts. I'm not trying to say you should only talk about this in terms of class. I'm really just trying to say these are possible impacts of making different narrative choices and to understand that for how different members of the public might respond to that. For next steps, I'm interested in altering the impact. So this is actually something that I've seen in other studies I've done. If we don't talk about this in terms of flooding, but look at other impact or risk contexts, how might that change things? And I say this specifically because flooding is really seen as a localized risk. So I'm curious about, for example, heat waves, which is seen as a less localized risk. Might that limit some of this kind of outgroup effects that we're seeing? And that's a question. I'm interested in changing the source of information. So you have someone talking about, say, impact to a community, but you're focusing on someone who's like low SES versus a Black spokesperson, how people may respond to that, and also how that could be mobilizing if you share an identity not with the impacted group, but by the spokesperson. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an interesting question. One study that I don't have results, we just got the data back from the field, but describing structural factors that cause disparities. There's some evidence in the health disparities literature that if you talk about causal factors about why those disparities exist, it can soften that difference in responses between class or race. And so I'm curious in this context if it will as well. But overall, I'm interested in how can communication strategies help circumvent social identity processes that are real and often happen, and then also minimize biases. And so that, I wanted to present this to you, partly because I'm interested in your reaction to it, but also it's a line of research I'm interested in doing over the next few years. And so with that, I will say thank you so much. And this is my email address, so if you do want to follow up with any questions after today over email, saulhart@umich.edu. I'm happy to talk to any of you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.